Down the river, across the river, to the river they came. Looking for game, looking for freedom, looking for a new life in a new land. Bringing their hopes, their cultures, their ambitions, and their dreams. For thousands of years, the Ohio River has been a gateway to the new, to new opportunities, to a new chance at life. These are the people who came here. These are the places that shaped southeastern Indiana into what it is today. And it all began along the Ohio River a very long time ago.
Take the River is made possible by a grant from Dearborn Community Foundation, Rising Sun Regional Foundation, Switzerland County Tourism, Dearborn County Convention Visitor and Tourism Bureau, Aurora Public Library District, Vivi Switzerland County Foundation, Ripley County Community Foundation, Historic Versailles Preservation Society, and by these kind funders.
Before Europeans arrived, even before what is now regarded as Native Americans arrived, some of southeastern Indiana's earliest settlers came up the Ohio River Valley 3,000 years ago. They found clear rivers and creeks and rich green hills with sparkling springs. It had been a long journey, and they decided to stay. Archaeologists now think they originated in Mexico and chose present-day Dearborn County, Indiana, as their new home, 1,000 years before Christ. Here, they built a hilltop citadel surrounded by a high wall of limestone rock. A writer in the Lawrenceburg Press described the imposing structure and drew a map as he remembered it as a schoolboy in 1816.
The stone walls were 8 feet high, built atop layers of raised earth. Beautiful stone axes, pottery, and arrowheads were found.
Another writer described a round stone floor plaza of some 12 acres, a large burial mound, and a signal fire site. In a time when most people in the world were rather short, these Ohio Valley residents were often 7 feet tall. They feasted on mussels and fish from the rivers and streams, grew sunflowers and squash, and traded for diverse products from far away, copper from the Great Lakes region, and seashells from the Gulf of Mexico. Yet their fortress citadel, believed to be the only structure of its kind in Indiana, remained almost unknown for thousands of years. And the verdant green hilltop they called home now overlooks Greendale, Indiana.
This was what I like to call Indiana's other Revolutionary War battle, and it definitely was. Lockery was on his way to meet George Rogers Clark for this expedition against Detroit.
A lot of people think that the Revolutionary War took place all on the up and down the East Coast, but this was a Revolutionary War battle fought between Americans at the time and the group of Indians who were backed by British soldiers.
The Indians were very much being encouraged, supplied, paid by the English to harry the frontiers and to go after anybody that they could that were among the rebels during the Revolution.
It is 6 years into the Revolutionary War, and Colonel Archibald Lockery is moving down the Ohio River with nearly 100 Pennsylvania militia on flatboats to rendezvous with General George Rogers Clark, who has staged a daring victory for the Americans by taking the British-held fort at Vincennes. Now, Clark means to take Detroit.
Well, the hope was that if they could defeat the English at Detroit, they would cut off the aid to the Indians and stop the attacks on Pennsylvania.
As a matter of fact, the British fort in Detroit was offering money for scalps, American scalps that were being brought to them.
The river, you have to know, in August was very, very low. And so What we think of as the Ohio now may have been only 20 or 30 feet wide and 3 or 4 feet deep. And in places, they actually had to get out and push their flatboat over the sandbars.
But Lockery and his men are not alone.
Waiting on the banks, hidden from view, was an Indian chief named Joseph Brant. He was a Mohawk from New York. He was a highly educated man and spoke excellent English. And he had spent quite some time in London. And he was a Mason. He was a highly civilized man.
Though Chief Brant is Mohawk, most of the Native American warriors with him are Shawnee, who have seen their villages, women, and children brutally attacked by Pennsylvanians. They have the element of surprise on their side, and they are out for blood.
Of course, they'd been pushed, the Indians had been pushed for years, pushed back, pushed back, pushed back, and they were simply fighting back.
Starting out with too little provisions, Lockery's men are out of food.
They were low on ammunition, and they were getting pretty hungry. So one of his soldiers shot a buffalo on the riverbank, right near where Lothry Creek now is. And despite orders not to go ashore, they did.
As the hungry men prepare a cooking fire and unload horses, Brant releases his surprise attack.
They attacked. Lockery and his men simply were not able to fend them off, and they very quickly lost the battle.
Men fall where they stand. Return fire is impossible. Out of ammunition, their rifles are useless. Some try for the river, where more warriors await them in canoes.
Brant had trouble controlling his Indian allies. They slaughtered about 40 of Lockery's men, including Colonel Lockery, before he could get them stopped.
Lockery is separated from his men. Before his men can shout a warning, one brave slips behind him and, in a flurry, brings a tomahawk down on his head, buries a knife in his side, and scalps him. Chief Brant is enraged and intercedes on the prisoner's behalf. Those two wounded to walk are tomahawked and scalped. The lucky ones are taken prisoner to Detroit. Many will never see their homes again.
The significance of this battle is that it was a rather major engagement during the Revolutionary War and a significant loss in which General George Rogers Clark lost half of his men.
Without Lockery's troops, Clark gave up on his idea of attacking Detroit, and that never happened.
And today we are reminded every day and that this is Lothry Creek, named after Colonel Archibald Lockery, and that's where we're standing.
It is February 1796, and Revolutionary War veteran Ephraim Morrison is moving his young family on a flatboat down the Ohio River to a new life in the West. On the left bank is Kentucky, civilization. To the right, Native Americans still claim their hunting grounds, Indiana. 3 settlers have been killed by Indians near the Ohio border the year before. Now, the Morrison family is floating even deeper into the wilderness, alone, and Ephraim's wife Nancy is pregnant. Just past Hogan Creek, he finds an abandoned Indian hut with neither floor nor roof. The family moves in on Valentine's Day, where Samuel Morrison is born, the first settler born in this part of Indiana.
There were a number of families that arrived during the 1790s, among them the Hayeses, who came and settled on the Miami River near Lawrenceburg. There was Adam Flake and his family who settled on Hogan Creek. The Cheeks arrived during the 1790s, and a family named Morrison, whose son was Samuel Morrison, and who became quite a well-known author and surveyor.
Adam Flake told me he and my father were the first families that ventured northwest of the Ohio River. There were great numbers of Indians encamped in the vicinity. Among the chiefs were Black Hoof and Blue Jacket. The Indians were of a tribe called Shawnees. Blue Jacket borrowed a saddle of father to accompany Simon Girty to Detroit. He came back faithfully and returned the saddle. Samuel Morrison.
On a dark night in 1798, the weary families of another war veteran, John Fulton, pull their flatboats to the Indiana shore. At daybreak, a vivid red glow is reported to arise, with scintillating rays glittering over the water. "Look, the rising sun," exclaims Fulton, and they decide to stay, where Rising Sun, Indiana is today. One thing for sure, a hearty attitude is required.
When some of my people came down, they came to Cincinnati. They had a flatboat in Cincinnati, or Losanaville was log cabins. They took horses and came down to Guilford. And they found their relatives up on York Ridge. Got the flatboat and brought it down to Lawrenceburg. Tore it apart and used those boards and everything out on York Ridge to live in.
Heathcote Pickett came here from through the Kentucky area, crossed the river, and went up a little creek called Plum Creek. And the first years of his life, he lived in a sycamore tree, in the base of a sycamore. But I know as a child, the sycamores along the Ohio River had huge root systems that we used to play inside those too. So, you know, to imagine a home in a sycamore tree, these trees were enormous at that time.
The early settlers made a rule that they would not kill a female elk or deer. Therefore, only bucks were killed, the does being left to breed. The Indians originated this custom. That is why the dressed leather from deer skins is called buckskin. Samuel Morrison.
You learn to be self-sufficient.
The Morrison family is also learning about their neighbors.
On the west bank of Tanner's Creek, the Indians had cleared up some 10 or 12 acres. On the edge stood a mound of mussels and clamshells 8 feet high. Blue Jacket told Father that the Indians made a feast of roasted clams every 12 moons, in remembrance of the great Manitou, who rules the fishes and the clams.
It's an exciting time to be a young pioneer.
Just below Aurora, Father shot a bear. It fell down, kicked, and at last lay still. Father reloaded, went up to the bear, and gave it a poke. The bear sprang to its feet and pursued him for some distance. Father wheeled and gave it a second shot. Down it tumbled, kicking and quivering as before. Thinking it dead for certain this time, Father punched it again, when it sprang to its feet and gave him a much closer chase than before. Father was obliged to drop his gun and save himself by running over a deep ravine on a slim branch. Samuel Morrison.
Before long, the area's first developer arrives.
Samuel Vance was a soldier from Pennsylvania who was actually the commander at Fort Washington in Cincinnati and was out scouting for some place to buy some land and do something good with it. And he was among the first purchasers of land in this part of Indiana. He bought a large, large amount of land which surrounded and included what is now Lawrenceburg. And he platted his town in 1802 and named it Lawrenceburg because his wife's maiden name was Lawrence.
Lawrenceburg is the 4th oldest city in Indiana. John James Dufour brings his family all the way from Vevey, Switzerland, to what is now Vevey, Indiana. The new immigrants call it New Switzerland. They plant vineyards and start making wine, delivering 2 casks to President Thomas Jefferson. The statesman Henry Clay travels from Lexington to Indiana's new Swiss colony to sample for himself, declaring the local Indiana wine of Louis Gay Cabusier superior to even his European stock. Clay leaves with 12 carefully packed bottles. Louis and those like him have brought an old culture and a budding new civilization to a wilderness that had been the domain of a centuries-old Native American way of life.
This was the frontier. And during the War of 1812, they built blockhouses in several locations. And then they had local troops that patrolled. Now, these blockhouses were like 20, 30 miles apart, so I'm not sure how much good those troops did, but I'm sure it made people feel better.
When I was a girl, I could run faster than any Indian. When I was 17, we all were suddenly called into fort at Guilford. The Indians were on the warpath. Our house was only a mile from the fort, and we had one of those pretty cedar churns. Indians or no Indians, I was going to get our churn. Out I went and got well on my way to the house when I saw a dog watching, ears cocked, and up jumped an Indian. I ran for the fort, the Indian in chase, but I was too quick for him. We told the Rangers and they started in pursuit. Mary Piles.
But not all frontier children had been as lucky. Young George Ashe was living with his parents in Bardstown, Kentucky in 1790.
I was about 10 years of age. We were attacked by Shawnee Indians. Part of my family was killed and the rest taken prisoners. We were separated from each other, except for my little sister, who was taken by the same group that had me. My sister was small. They carried her for 2 or 3 days, but she cried and gave them trouble, so they tomahawked and scalped her and left her lying on the ground. After this, I was transferred from one Indian family to another several times. I was treated harshly, and they called me a white dog, till at length I was considered a member of one of the families. After this, I was treated like the other children of the tribe and given an Indian name.
Young George spends 17 years among the Indians and fights in the biggest Indian victory over an American army ever, St. Clair's defeat. His brother is killed fighting on the other side. In later life, Ash runs a ferry boat in Lamb, Indiana. Although wealthy enough to build the area's first 2-story brick home, he continues to live and dress in Shawnee fashion. Adam Moore arrives in 1818 and builds a mill in western Dearborn County. Settlers petition the government for a post office there, but the Postmaster General mistakes the M in mill to be an H and grants a post office to Moore's Hill. It's been Moore's Hill ever since. Another town is laid out in 1830, but there are no funds to pay the recording fee. General James Dill volunteers to do it for free, if he can name the town after himself, Dillsboro.
The first settlers, the Ohio River was their highway. This was the way that people and commerce moved.
A friend of mine I read an account of his family. They went to the bank, borrowed some money, bought some pork. There's pork in barrels, bought tobacco, and I don't know what all. And they put it on a flatboat, and he went to New Orleans. Imagine going from there, this was from Vevey. Go from Vevey to New Orleans on a flatboat. Fight the storms and the runouts and everything else. Then they would stop different places and ask if anybody needed any pork. And if they could get the right price for it, they'd sell it, and then they'd buy something that they had to sell. And finally they got to New Orleans, they sold all their load. They had huckstered all the way down. Bought and sold, bought and sold, bought and sold when they got down. They went back to Cincinnati and paid off their loan. And they had $1,000. $1,000. And the banker was so proud of them, he says, you boys come back anytime and we'll loan you more money. So eventually they had a steamboat. To make a long story short, which is almost too late now, but they eventually had steamboats.
Early on, you know, before steam and before the steamboats, that's how the farmers did it. They would build a flatboat, and then they would put their produce on that flatboat and then float it to New Orleans, Natchez, and places like that. And then when they got there, they would disassemble them, sell the wood, and hopefully have enough money to buy a horse or something, come back the Natchez Trail.
By the mid-1800s, all over southeastern Indiana, people are making hay.
Jesse Hott operated one of the first large-scale hay presses here in Lawrenceburg, which enabled them to ship hay downriver on flatboats and really enhanced the trade.
Hay is needed to feed the animals that keep transportation moving, like oil is needed today. In 1843, a new hay press patent in Switzerland County has Justin Thibault producing 400-pound bales on the Thibault farmstead, first settled by his Swiss parents. By 1860, Justin and his wife Mary build a Greek revival home overlooking the river and fill it with 10 children. Hard work and the hay press have brought the first industry to the growing country's western frontier. Hay is in demand in New Orleans, in New York, even Europe, and Ulysses P. Schenck of Vevey knows how to supply it.
We were a hay shipping capital of the world at that time. There was, some people think, 400 to 600 barns that had hay presses in them. He was the hay king because he shipped it, U.P. Schenck.
shipping on the Ohio River becomes a very good business for the Schenck family. Some of the settlers of southeastern Indiana have come a long way.
I guess it's a tribute to Dearborn County or to the people who came here. But there are still lots of Hayes descendants, there are still lots of Flake descendants, there are still lots of Cheek descendants in the county, and a lot of them are still involved in the community.
You know, the river was a dividing point. You know, the Indians said, okay, this is our hunting ground and you guys stay there, and we didn't stay there. Time marches on. And, you know, we went through wars, we went through Indian wars, we went through a lot of things. And you can't help feeling that connection.
You don't look for anybody to come to your aid, you just make it work. So free enterprise build us, and free enterprise will take us on.
Can you imagine being someone else's property? The marriage you have with your wife, if you're married, does not at all exist in the rule of law. You are property. Now, you're white, I'm black, but you left Europe so you could be free. You did not want somebody telling you what to do. We share that as human beings.
It is the first half of the 1800s. To have any chance of freedom, runaway slaves need to brave crossing the Ohio River and keep moving north.
The Ohio River is a border, and we call it a border because of geographic reality. It's also a connector, and we call it the Freedom Corridor. Everybody used it, the Native Americans, the white settlers, the enslaved people used that same piece of space, looking for freedom.
Some fugitive slaves managed to slip across the river at Lamb, or Vivi. Just north of there, Reverend John Pavey and his sons hide runaway slaves in a flax wagon heading north. From Patriot, two Baptist congregations shelter and transport runaways near Kirkus Grove.
A lot of them are willing to give chances to people who don't look like them. So what you had to do was find a friendly face, and I see your smile. I take a chance, and maybe you would smile at me because the sheriff was your first cousin. But I had to take that chance. I'm hungry, I got my wife, or I got one of my sons with me, and we haven't eaten in days, and I need help.
Crossing the river at Rising Sun, or Aurora, runaways might follow the North Polar Star route up through Moores Hill, sheltered by Orthaniel Reed in Wilmington, or from Manchester Landing to Stephen Harding's home outside Old Milan.
Stephen Harding was an abolitionist. He also ran an underground railroad out of his home. They had a big place in the basement for the men, and the women and children are upstairs and in the attic even. And one lady told me just yesterday that she used to play in that house, and she said there was a big long tunnel we used to run up and down in the basement where they would get out to the road so someone could pick them up.
If a white person got caught, in a lot of cases, the fine was so horrendous that you lost everything you owned. There were people who lost farms, people who lost families, over principle, and yet they did it.
In June of 1844, Stephen Harding takes his views public in front of a hostile crowd at the Ripley County Courthouse in Versailles.
So he came here at the county seat to make this big speech, but no one was listening. They didn't want to hear it. You know, back then it was a very touchy subject, and they didn't want to hear it. They actually was in danger from these people. They were just really riled up.
Amid this explosive atmosphere, it is said, from an upper window in the courthouse, someone yells above the crowd, "Let the man speak."
So he got inside and he made one of the most famous abolition speeches.
On a steamboat, Harding meets and befriends Abraham Lincoln, who appoints Harding governor of the Utah Territory. Yet, Harding returns to southeastern Indiana to continue his work helping escaped slaves.
I don't know what influenced Mr. Harding, but the fact that he was a good and honest and decent man, and I think that had a lot to do with it. You know, a lot of people disagree with things, but they don't want to make a stand, and I think Mr. Harding did.
Despite the risk to runaways and those who shelter them, underground railroads are in Osgood, Delaware, Napoleon, and more. Congregants of the Flat Rock Free Will Baptist Church are moving runaways north in double-floored wagons. Along Tanner's Creek, half a dozen families or more transport runaway slaves in farm wagons at night.
The Wyman family, who owned the house where the Dearborn Country Club used to be, sheltered slaves there. And in Lawrenceburg, there was an African-American blacksmith named Elijah Anderson. At one point, he told someone much later that he had helped 1,000 slaves escape after passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was when he was here in Lawrenceburg. The story goes that his blacksmith shop was near the river, and he had worked out a way of notifying escaping slaves from Boone County that it was safe to come over. He would tap a certain code on the anvil, which they could hear across the river and know whether it was safe to come across or not. He was eventually arrested aboard a riverboat and put in prison in Kentucky, where he died under rather mysterious circumstances a few years later.
The Underground Railroad system worked because of, again, the human spirit being the driving force.
It's Sunday, July 12th, 1863, and the Civil War is coming directly to Versailles, Indiana, in a hurry.
This was the most significant event to occur in Indiana during the American Civil War.
Confederate General John Hunt Morgan of Lexington, Kentucky, has invaded Indiana, and now his raiders are swarming into Versailles.
Indiana citizens were terrorized, frightened out of their wits.
The Ripley County Treasury is being buried in a garden. Women are hiding jewelry in beanstalks. Men are off hiding horses.
The mood in Versailles was a combination of fearfulness as well as enchanted with a celebrity.
Women, it's reported, was swooned just at the sight of Morgan riding through town.
There were Southern sympathizers who were living in the Versailles area. And when those people saw Morgan coming down the road, they start cheering him. Morgan, Morgan, Morgan's coming. But most of the people in Versailles were Unionists, abolitionists. They did not believe in the Southern cause, and so they were fearful of Morgan.
They didn't know whether Morgan and these raiders had come to start a battle or kill people or rob, burn houses.
300 local men assemble on the courthouse lawn to defend against 2,000 oncoming Confederate raiders. The raiders aim a cannon at the courthouse and, without a shot, seize the local defenders' guns and bend the barrels against the corner of the courthouse. And the raiders are free to do what they want.
Morgan and his men were the last of the chivalrous warriors. Morgan told his men, when we go up north, respect the women and children.
Bursting into the courthouse, Morgan's brother, Colonel Richard Morgan, finds little more than ladies' purses in the safe. Told they are the savings of widows, he gallantly replies,
"Keep them safe. I never robbed a widow yet."
But Versailles is at the raiders' mercy. Town stores are looted. Housewives' pantries are empty as they're forced to cook for the invaders. At the Last Chance Hotel, the raiders drink the entire stock of whiskey and beer and move out. Thousands of Union cavalry under Brigadier General Edward Henry Hobson are closing in, and trainloads more Union troops are on their way from Indianapolis, all chasing General John Hunt Morgan.
The purpose of Morgan's raid was a diversion.
The raid here was his own idea. His commanders, his leaders, told him not to cross the Ohio River into Indiana and Ohio.
He was just a natural-born raider behind enemy lines. He was a many-faceted character. He was raised by a multimillionaire grandfather. who doted on him and gave him the best of everything.
He was a product of the Kentucky aristocracy, and he was a bit of a showman. He was much like a rock star, I suppose, in his time.
He was accustomed to being around beautiful women, and he was a real gentleman.
Morgan spends much of the raid in a buggy, only mounting his show horse before entering towns.
Because he was accustomed to sleeping in feather beds, that when they were camping out with his troops, he would always find a hotel nearby to sleep in. His men could sleep in a tent, but not Morgan.
Morgan brings a slave through southeastern Indiana, his personal valet. A few nights later, the valet will vanish, courtesy of the Underground Railroad. But for now, the raiders fan out over the Indiana countryside.
They had to get fresh horses, and they had to eat.
They burn bridges over Laufrey Creek and Greasy Run near Versailles, Pierceville and Milan, and the railroad bridge at Osgood.
They were a raggedy bunch, and they were mean. That was the other thing. These guys were tough.
Outside of Pierceville, Indiana, the raiders come across an aging preacher named Reverend Horsley and shout instructions for the old man of faith to halt. But Reverend Horsley is deaf and doesn't hear their warning. Thinking he is ignoring their orders, the raiders shoot the country preacher dead. It is said at the tiny village of Harmon Station, raiders find a wedding in progress and shoot a man named John Salden. Residents say he was killed for no good reason. Indiana is in a state of panic.
Governor Morton, Oliver Morton at that time, was as frightened by the stories of Morgan as much as any of the citizens.
Fearing the worst, German farmers near Dillsboro take their horses, livestock, and families south to the tiny village of Ocktown to hide. In St. John's Church, they pray the raiders pass them by. Their prayers are answered, and the town's name is changed to Farmers Retreat.
What happened around Sunmanville, and today it's Sunman, Indiana, is that Morgan was coming up from the river, heading up towards Sunman. Well, General Lew Wallace in Indianapolis was sent down to stop Morgan, and he came down by train with hundreds of soldiers.
Morgan, wary, stops just 2 miles south of Sunman at the Ferris Schoolhouse, camping his raiders in an adjacent field.
Morgan did stay that night in Sunman and slept in that schoolhouse. He slept at the foot of the teacher's desk, and his men were bringing reports in all throughout the night.
The significance of being this close to Sunman is that in Sunman, on this very night that Morgan and many of his men were camped right here, there were 1,800 Union soldiers in railroad cars on a siding in Sunman, like 2-3 miles away.
And the people in Sunman realized if they find out where each of them are, there's going to be a big battle. We could get killed by just the crossfires. So they kept quiet. They didn't tell Morgan's men or even General Wallace where their adversaries were.
They probably knew the enemy was close by. But at that point, nobody was all that anxious to engage in a battle. So it's almost an unsaid mutual agreement that we'll leave each other alone.
And in the following morning, Lew Wallace took the train down to Lawrenceburg, while Morgan then headed over towards West Harrison. So they passed in the night without any battle.
In the morning, Morgan allows half of the Union troops in Sunman to pass by rail, then burns the railroad bridges near Harmon Station and Weisburg.
Once those Union troops passed on to Lawrenceburg, they were isolated, they were ineffective, and that's exactly what Morgan wanted to accomplish.
The remaining Union forces, now stranded in Sunman, set out for Lawrenceburg on foot. By night, the march will turn deadly. Despite his cunning, or because of it, Morgan now has 8,000 Union cavalry troops in close pursuit. The raiders meet up in New Alsace. While the priest at St. Paul's Catholic Church is conducting Mass, they steal his horses.
And at that time, there were 13 taverns in this little community, and the story goes that The raiders drank the town dry.
The town blacksmith is put to work, reshotting horses, while his wife, Elizabeth Vogelsang, and her orphan niece, Philomena Young, serve the raiders pancakes. Years later, one of the raiders realizes Philomena Young is his long-lost sister. The raiders now push on through Dover, Logan, then West Harrison and the Ohio border. Union troops arrive just 2 hours behind to find the bridge Morgan used to escape in flames. Morgan and his men are on the longest ride of their entire raid, 95 miles in a day and a half, with no rest.
If there be a man who boasts of a march, let him excel this. Confederate Colonel James McCreary, southeastern Indiana, 1863.
Though Morgan and his men have now crossed into Ohio, reports of his whereabouts are still causing mayhem in Indiana that night.
The rumors about Morgan's raid into Indiana were far worse than the facts. And the rumors spread quickly and they would become exaggerated.
A false report that Morgan is doubling back alarms Lawrenceburg. At 9 p.m., a Union regiment moves out past Hardentown to set up a defense.
It was, as far as fatalities and so forth, the worst day for the Union troops occurred in Lawrenceburg. The forces that had taken the train were already in Lawrenceburg, and here come these others walking in. And as they did, those Union troops that had already been there thought that they're all skittish, that here comes Morgan's men, and they started firing into each other.
Colonel Klein Shyrod, sensing the catastrophe, rides courageously into the fusillade, commanding the Union soldiers to stop killing each other, but not before 5 are dead and 18 wounded.
There were more Union fatalities that day than there was in the entire Morgan raid.
They had a very lively and jubilant evening in Lawrenceburg, but the termination was a sad one. Cincinnati Enquirer.
Morgan's raid has left Indiana, but left a tragedy behind. Amid cannon celebration in Aurora on the 4th of July, 1824, Pinckney James launches the area's first steamboat and launches a new way of life. By 1850, there are thousands of steamboats on the Ohio River.
They would actually be in competition to see who would have the most luxurious steamboat. So some of those boats were beautiful. They would have gingerbread everywhere, Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers, silver tea services. They were just unbelievable.
Travel had never been so grand.
On the boats, they had separate men's and women's parlors. The women would basically sew and gossip, and the men would drink, smoke, and gamble. People had to depend on the river to get all their goods for their entertainment. There was a boat called the Ivory Wood. It was a floating general store. Showboats regularly came to this area. There would be circus boats that operated on the river. There would be floating churches that came up and down the river. And one of the most interesting one was the floating medicine show.
Steam power is driving industry on land, too. Immigrant brothers James, John, and Thomas Gaff built a distillery, brewery, a fortune in steamboat shipping, and beautiful homes shadowing the area's first log cabin built just 30 years earlier. During the Civil War, the Gaffs offered their fleet of steamboats to the Union Army. Captained by C.D. Conway of Aurora, Gaff's steamboat, Forest Queen, runs the Vicksburg blockade and becomes General Sherman's headquarters during the siege of Vicksburg, only to be burned by Confederates later in St. Louis.
The Civil War really did a number on the steamboats because most of them were either drafted into service, and if they were in battle, they would often be, sunk.
As new forms of transportation become available, the steamboat era gradually fades, but its effect on this area endures today. By the 1900s, the fastest boats on the river are going just 12 miles per hour. Bicycles go faster. Until J.W. Whitlock, a Rising Sun furniture factory owner, starts making his own boats. And boy, do they go. In 1924, Whitlock pilots his Hoosier Boy speedboat on a round trip from Cincinnati to Louisville. 267 miles in 267 minutes and 49 seconds. Racing through driftwood and barge waves, he's averaged nearly 60 miles per hour. And Rising Sun, Indiana, is home to the fastest boats in the world.
It was a wet, snowy winter, I recall that.
January 21st, 1937. In the midst of a cold winter, the Ohio is pouring itself downriver.
I think the announcement was made in school that that the river was rising rapidly and they needed help, and they invited the boys to go down to the levee to help bag sand and stack sandbags on the top of the levee. And I was there until dusk.
Lawrenceburg's 75-foot levee, once thought impregnable, is about to go under.
The bells of the churches and the whistles of factories were blown about midnight. That's the way they signaled that the water was coming in.
Water began coming over the levee on the east end of town, but then it gave way completely at the west end of town, and in that first rush of water, 32 houses were swept away. Before it was all over, there were over 300 houses that were totally destroyed. I mean, they just tumbled and broke into pieces.
The river crests at 82 feet, higher than it has ever been, before or since.
Lawrenceburg was inundated, Aurora was inundated, and one of the things that it did in Patriot is it rolled the library over and flushed it down the street, so that the town library is laying on its side. It completely covered Florence, and then VV, it reached all the way up to Main Street. The whole flood area, I think there was over 400 people that lost their lives.
People on higher ground open their homes to friends and strangers alike. In Greendale, a Red Cross tent city goes up for 100 families. But Lawrenceburg needs food, and all roads and train tracks are underwater.
Word went out that Red Cross would hire young men to row boats from Segram's warehouse. So I volunteered. They hired me. They gave me 2 oars and a flat-bottom metal boat. So I got in the boat and I started across Tanner's Creek. It was water completely from there, Ohio River Valley, the Lawrenceburg, everything.
At Rising Sun, half of Front Street is gone. VV's power plant nearly washes away. Hundreds of homes and everything else are floating down the river. Young Frank Savage rows a boat through his second-story window. As the water recedes from the top floor, his family begins cleanup, burning their furniture for heat.
The water stayed in Lawrenceburg for about 14 days, and then when it went down, it was just an unbelievable, chaotic mess.
To walk through the city of Lawrenceburg and see the utter destruction of just about every building in town, that was an impression, and it lived with me for a lot of years. And how the people came back and rebuilt. I think what they thought was we were going to whip this, build the levee higher, and they did.
The 1937 flood leaves destruction, hardship, and struggle in its wake, but also images of generosity, community strength, and heritage that are still part of the people here today.
Down on the beach, we had our own gang, and we went down right up the river here,
there was a sandbar across from the Aurora.
And it was called the Sons of Beaches.
Well, I wasn't going to say that.
I knew you weren't going to say that. We had a lot of parties.
A lot of parties.
Oh, my. Ski.
No, I ain't going to tell that story.
But you know, you were talking about one time when the boat harbor broke loose and you floated down the river, and I remember I was with a state trooper who we were trying to throw lights on you.
So the lightning done that, took care of that.
Yeah, you had no lights or anything, and he had this state trooper, I can't remember which one it was now, had big spotlights, and we trying to help him because he was floating down the river on these docks that just cut loose with boats attached.
I didn't want to lose it, and really, as far as being any danger, I didn't see any danger in it at all.
The river changes, it's something always changing, there's always something going on.
My grandparents, on a weekend or on a Sunday, they would row down here just for the afternoon and had to row back. But at that time, they had, the dresses went clear to their ankles.
Yeah.
In fact, I'll get you that picture with my grandmother and her sister and my granddad with the double-barrel shotgun over his shoulder. This is the end of the glacier push in the Great Ice era. And that's what they call sedimentary rock that was been pushed down from Canada. They raised the river here approximately 28 foot. And it was clear out of water. You could walk around those rocks. And out in the river, there was another rock protruding out of the water. You could walk, it had water all the way around it, that you could actually dive off of it. And it was that much lower. Here at Lower Aurora, it was so shallow that the stern wheels had to turn around back over. And then they raised the river in the, I'm going to say the 20s, about 8 foot. And they had multiple locks all the way up to Pittsburgh. Along 60, they come along and put higher dams, like Markland's put in there. They eliminated 3 locks that raised the river here at Aurora about 28 foot. So in other words, in round figures, they raised the water here 30 foot over the original pool to get navigation. There's more tonnage. Now this was a few years ago, went by Aurora than at any point on the Ohio that went through the Panama Canal.
I remember coming down and we'd line up on the riverbank and watch Bobby Lischke ski. And nobody had seen that, only in newsreels. And he was skiing and put on quite a show on Sundays, I guess it was. But it was just part of life. Everybody knew everybody in those days. Bobby was serious and always working. And I was out there.
You went out flying.
I was dances and everything. He never went to dances. Did you ever go to a dance?
Of course I did. We went to the Blue Bubble.
We did?
Yeah.
You and me?
Mm-hmm.
You always have to plan for the worst, and it'll teach you to respect it.
I remember one time I got thrown in the river in February.
That's before we was married.
Oh yeah, I was watching this boat, and it was a friend of mine, a classmate. And I thought, he's gonna flip that boat. He was a race boat, big engine.
You and I was running together.
Yeah, you and him used to race all the time. And I thought, we all stood there on the bank and said, he's gonna flip that boat. He came in, want to go for a ride, Tessie? Yeah, sure. Got in it and flipped in the middle of the river in February. It was pretty chilly. One of the Baker boys pulled me out. Thank God he had a boat there.
I'd probably sitting back laughing at you.
Probably, I don't know where you were. So I was wild and crazy. At one time, God, that seems like 100 years ago.
The river is home around here. It's part of the town.
When I remember the 1937 flood, We had a barn down in back of our house, and we had people living in that. And we had people living in our home. And of course, I was young, but I remember all those people there, and our house caught on fire. It was on Black Sunday, when it was raining on top of the snow and the sleet. And the firemen couldn't get to the house, and they crawled on their hands up on Fifth Street.
One other thing happened on Black Sunday was my granddad's birthday. And that day, his house went down the river, completely. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, the river was really dirty. And this river right now is many times cleaner than it was back then.
Do you remember any really funny times? Is there
oh my God. Some of them, I don't dare tell some of the stories. I mean, come on, Dennis.
Tessie and I and two other couples went to Madison on my dad's boat.
Louisville.
We went to Louisville. And we went down there to that yacht club in Louisville, and we tied up there. I've never been any place like it since. They come down and waited on us with white towels over their arms and took our orders and brought it to us.
You would have thought we were Mr. and Mrs. Scott Rocks. Oh, Lord.
That was one of the...
And we were just river folk.
One thing, it's home.
He and Lori, Robert both, they'll say, oh, Mom, there's nothing like that beautiful Ohio River. And it is beautiful, look at it. We've got beautiful down here.
This area right through here is really outstanding.
Oh, this is home. I've always come home. I love our quirky little unique Aurora.
This is home to me.
If you would read Huckleberry Finn, that's kind of the story of my childhood.
We had boats before we had bicycles, and that's the honest to goodness truth. And we made some of them, and they weren't too nice looking, but they got us there. So, you know, we learned pretty early, you know, the value of freedom.
That was a story of us, really.
This area is kind of quaint because a lot of the families that first settled here still have ancestry here that never moved out of this area, and the history has stayed in this community.
Yeah, I'm always amazed. People from upstate who have not been down here are just fascinated by this river. People who have lived here all their lives don't even bother to look at it half the time, but people who come here from somewhere else, it's just like, wow.
People say, well, of all the places you've been, where would you like to retire? And I say, Aurora, Indiana. Can't help it.
I think they see the quality of life in a small town like Rising Sun. And every year, when we have our Memorial Day program at Rising Sun, and I tell the people there, I say, this is small town America at its best.
Today, a group of veterans and well-wishers gather at a graveyard on a family farm in Ohio County, Indiana, to dedicate new gravestones for 2 Revolutionary War veterans buried here.
This, to me, is awesome. You know, and I'm carrying now my military knowledge out here and as an example, trying to dress the way my 5th great grandfather probably dressed.
It was nice to see the young people here, the kids and all, because if we don't pass it on from one generation to the next, then it's going to be lost.
You know, that sticks with you, and anybody that was raised that way, you know, in this part of the world will always say that, you know, they want to get back to the river. They want to get back to the water because it's a pull.
From its ancient civilizations 3,000 years ago to the communities of today, the Ohio River has been southeastern Indiana's connection to the world, a boundary and a superhighway, a barrier to overcome, a dare to cross, an escape to freedom, a transport to a new life. Bring your dreams, it seems to say, and take the river.
To purchase a Take the River DVD or for other viewing options, visit hhhills.org.
Take the River is made possible by a grant from Dearborn Community Foundation, Rising Sun Regional Foundation, Switzerland County Tourism, Dearborn County Convention Visitor and Tourism Bureau, Aurora Public Library District, Vivi Switzerland County Foundation, Ripley County Community Foundation, Historic Versailles Preservation Society, and by these kind funders: